You ain't wishing on anybody, huh? Well, he was sounding pretty good up until that point.
Right. So he
Never mind.
go with that. So,
Well, let him go with it. Really, I think all of them are about the same.
yeah, it's nasty. In fact, right now, I have that one. I think my deductible was $500. And, I have not met it for the year yet, and I did something to my back of my, I don't know, pulled the muscle right underneath my shoulder blade a couple of weeks ago. And the doctor gave me at first I thought, well, I'm having a heart attack, but I had just been to her Monday before all this happened for a well woman, and she had done an EKG, so I thought, no, it's not heart, this is something else. Anyway, she put me on some real strong painkiller, plus she gave me muscle relaxer, and I told her, I said, those things have never helped me at all, but the one she gave me, I'm telling you what, that when the druggist, I got picked it up at the drugstore, she said, the lady says, the druggist came to witness, she said, have you ever taken this before? I said, no, but I've never been on a pain, muscle relaxer that ever helped. She said, don't you drive. She said, don't you drive while you're on it.
It sounds like you shouldn't give them both of them the same,
And, I say, painkiller, it was just 800 milligrams Tylenol. And I did take not ibuprofen, I've been taking 1,000 milligrams of Tylenol, spaced out, and this other one. So I thought, she said I could alternate it if I needed it. Well, anyway, the muscle relaxant, I took that stuff, and I just sat down in the chair.
Oh, sure.
I was alive.
Yeah. I think that's about you went out for days.
I did that for 2 days, and I said, no more, I'll hurt, thank you very much. But anyway, she wanted me to do that for a week, and then she wanted me to have an x-ray. Well, I had to go have the x-ray made today. And of course, I had to pay, the doctor's visit plus the x-ray. So I think I'm probably back to the point where, because I had been to another doctor just for a usual 6 month visit that I go to all the time, and I have to pay that. So I'm thinking I probably need to let the doctor.
Well, see that devoted certain things, you don't have to pay for. But you know what I don't like about them? I know this is crazy. They bug you. They're calling you, how are you doing? They're telling you, did you get this test and that test? And then when you go, I don't care what it is, anything they want you to do it. And then they send you, when you get your breast x-ray, they send you a little card for $25. You go in, like I'm supposed to go in 2 weeks and, go on that treadmill and all that.
Yeah.
They'll send me another card for $25. I mean, they're pushing you, want me to do it. And they're only in like 7 states. And they came down here, like I said, it's either 2 or 3 years ago. And I think they've really got a good deal for these doctors, really, because I think they're paying these doctors too, you know what I mean? And so the nurse said, oh, yes, he loves it. He thinks it's going to be really good. So I thought, well, it sounds good to me too.
So you were able to keep your doctor?
Oh, yeah. He's my primary doctor. Yeah, like primary, but you can go anywhere. But they give you a book of the doctors. That's the only thing you may not like. But if you look, you might have your doctor in there because they've gone out and they've gotten all these in Pasadena. And then you can go down to the medical center. Because I asked them, I said, well, look, if I have to have a heart operation, I'm going to St. Louis where my mother went downtown. Can I do that? And they talk to you. They're real nice. They'll stay on the line with you forever. And, yes, ma'am, you can go, yes, that's, yes, you can. So they're really good, but it's just so funny, it's either $10 or they'll send you a card for 25, and so I'm thinking, well, pretty good.
I've got several things, from United Healthcare for, I think they were both for home nursing visits at home.
Yeah, they want you to do that. I did do the only one with the doctor, we did Skype, and she was a woman, and I was sitting in my living room, and she was sitting in hers, and she started, talking and asking me, how when you first come on, they want to know what you have, what you don't have, all that. But she's real nice. But most of the time, you can call them anytime you want to.
I just happen to think, I bet he has had such a friendly day. I bet he has not seen this. I saw a deal. It was right here.
Is it from some of our students?
One of the students, once I saw the little lady, did you see the deal from one of the students about she wouldn't be online tonight? But
No, I didn't.
Where's the lady that used here?
Well, she was late last time. I thought maybe she might be. But this lady said,
Sandra,
I should have written her name down.
Ada.
Let me go back through this one. Our phones are crazy. I get all of his emails. Come to me as well. So mine.
Yeah, I've got a new phone, and I don't like mine
either. I'll get out.
This phone is crazy. I like all of them better.
Well, let's see. When I saw her name, I thought, I wonder if he would have even maybe, because I didn't check. And once in a while, I get something on here that wants me very stuff.
Oh, there she is. She must be doing it at home.
Oh, maybe she did, Angie. Yeah.
She probably thought it was going to be too bad today, tonight.
Here, Angie Knox, that's her.
That's
Yeah.
her.
I won't be quiet.
But she's online.
I had a CPR.
Hi there.
good evening.
I made it after all. She canceled
Well,
on
good.
me. Well,
Oh, no.
it's good and not good because this is the second time that it gets that she cancels. So it's too bad I couldn't make it in person.
Well, it's too cold to be out anyway.
Yeah.
What was that?
I said, if somebody cancels on me like that, I just say, well, I guess it's not meant to be, so just don't worry.
Okay. Well, let's dive in.
Is some of this paperwork from last?
There's a review for you to do from last week in there somewhere. But most of the paperwork is for this week. The first few scriptures in the Old Testament you will recognize probably from last week.
Okay, five from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
You want us to turn this into next week?
Yeah, that's fine.
And then you're starting tonight with how we got the Bible outside.
No, Old Testament canon we start with tonight.
When is the review due?
Yes.
The one you sent today, when is it due?
There's a second one that I sent on outside of the canon.
Yeah.
And I sent those way late, but I sent them, so, but I'll be showing them on here anyway, hopefully.
I think you were getting.
Let's see.
You're talking about These books that are in the Catholic Bible. I read the Bible in through the Bible every year.
Mhm.
And I always try to use a different, translation. And one year I decided, because my cousin I know she didn't use it, I read the Jerusalem
Well.
Bible, and it has all the Apocrypha.
Yeah,
And it was really interesting.
that's really interesting. I know.
Why they aren't showing up? They're open here. But that won't do us any good.
And I thought it was interesting, my name's Judith. And,
Well, maybe they're not. No. Oh,
for technical purposes. Everybody else calls me Sissy.
let's see. They're going to cross me up here. No,
So the one from last week, we turned that in to you as well, correct?
yeah, you could fill it out and send it back to me,
Okay.
and I'll send you one then on tonight's material.
Review the writings of the Old Testament from last week.
Yes. Okay, now how can I get to this? As saved material, as shared material.
So much.
Well, now it's closed this down to a bare there we go. Share.
Good evening, everybody.
The screen. Well, that's intriguing. Select. Why doesn't it show me the screen? Are any of you able to get to your files?
Yes, sir. I'm trying to print them right now.
I've never had this wrinkle before.
You're having problems sharing your screen with us?
Yeah, it's not showing me my PDFs. It's showing me this screen.
Where do you have them saved?
They're they're open on the computer, but they're not showing up on the share mechanism. New share. See, they don't show up on my share screen. I have the whiteboard and the iPhone even. And
Does it show you an option to go to the folder where it's saved in?
no, it doesn't. It shows the documents that are open, but on Edge, it opens the PDFs up in Edge, and it doesn't show me the Edge form. As I said, I'd always opened them before without any trouble, and they showed right up. For me to share, because I've always shared PDFs on here. But for some reason, it's not showing that screen. It shows this screen, but it doesn't show this screen. Were any of you able to open the files I sent?
Yes,
Yes.
I was.
Okay. They have printed copies here. We're going to look at the Old Testament canon first. 5 pages. And just a brief wrestling with the word canon. It gets used in different ways. Initially, it seems to be the canon was used as the measure for feeling like certain books should be considered more important than others. But once there began to be a group of books referred to with a little more authority than others, then you end up, the canon becomes the standard that everything else has to measure up to. What we saw last week in a couple of passages, and even in the Old Testament, is an awareness of some material to which one should make reference, as though it expressed some importance, value, even authority. And you see this all the way back in the Old Testament. Moses is instructed to write. In Deuteronomy, the king is instructed to read the copy of the law that he has. In Joshua, when he assumes command, there is a reading of the word of Moses. And in chapter 24, verse 26, Joshua adds to that collection, however extensive it was, or how limited it was. And then, as we saw last week, there are numerous mentions of the book of the law of the Lord, the book of the law of Moses, the law of Moses, the book of Moses, and we have that all the way through the passage we looked at in 2 Kings 22, where Josiah has a book found in the renovation of the temple. In the experience of Jeremiah, he's under arrest, and there's some pretty serious charges against him. And there's a recognition that there was an earlier prophet. There's no mention necessarily of a written document, but they remember his message, and it was a negative message. And the people took it as the word of the Lord and said, well, then there's nothing we can do about what the prophet said. So maybe we better be careful what we do with Jeremiah. In Daniel, we have Daniel reading the books. Nehemiah and Esther, we have the reading of the books. And then this closes in the 6th century, the 500s. There may be some of the other material written there. And then between then and the New Testament, we have some written material that makes reference to some of these Old Testament books, or is used in such a way that demonstrates it has some importance. The people we know in the New Testament as the Samaritans, there's considerable controversy as to when they arose and under what circumstances, for what reason. The traditional view that these are some of the people who stay in Palestine when the exiles occur, and therefore they're not considered quite true believers, especially when they build their own alternative temple. There's real problems with that tradition, both in terms of its age, but the importance is that they have the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, that the Jews do. And that's a collection for them. They actually have most of the book of Joshua too. But they refer to the books of the book of Moses, the book of the law. Beginning in the 3rd century, these books that we now have in our Old Testament began to be translated for Greek-speaking Jews. It gets called the Septuagint, which is Greek for 70, because there is a little document now having been discovered that tells the story of the Greek Ptolemy leader of Egypt. Remember, after Alexander the Great conquers Egypt and the Levant and all the way over into Persia, all of his successors rule that area. They're all Greeks. And the Greek leaders in Egypt are very high on learning and education. They begin to compile a huge library, Alexandria, that Alexander built, eventually displaces Athens as the learning center of the world of the day. And this little book of, a little document, the letter of Aristeas, says that Ptolemy asked for the books of the Jews. And so they commissioned 70, one tradition says 72, of their scholars to go to Jerusalem and collect at the temple all of their books and translate them. And the story in the book is, in the little letter is, that they come back with the scrolls and they each do all of them independently and they all come out identical. And we know of this document, we know of these translations in a couple of ways. The longest we've known about them is that in the 4th and the 5th century, 300s and 400s after Jesus, there are 3 editions of the quote Bible we'll look at. It's all Greek, and the Old Testament is in Greek like the New Testament, and it has most of the books that we have in our Old Testament, plus some others, depending on which one of those books you look at. And so we have accustomed ourselves to talking about the Septuagint as though it were an intact book, and nothing like that existed until after the time of Jesus. It was not translated the same way. The copies that we have, they're clearly translated almost from a word-for-word translation in some books to a complete paraphrase in other books. And since the Jews only had these documents as individual scrolls, there would have been copies of these Greek translations of their books floating around. It's those Greek versions that get used by the writers of the New Testament. About half the times the Old Testament is quoted in the New Testament. It's pretty close to the Greek translation as it has come down to us. But even there is some variety. And now we know of other versions of this from scraps in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we know there was not a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. There were several translations of some of the books, at least. And in some respects, the versions, the copies that have come down to us are different from each other. They're different from the Hebrew Bible. The book of Jeremiah in the Greek version is way smaller than the Hebrew version, just as one issue. Then there are a lot of other writings that arose in this time from Ezra and Nehemiah to the time of Jesus and to the close of the 1st and 2nd century of the Christian era. One of those is the Wisdom of Ben Sarak, often called Ecclesiasticus. And in it, he mentions several times the law and the prophets and the other volumes of the fathers. And so you have a specific mention of a collection. He somewhat identifies it, but not very specifically. One of the other books that gets written in that time is a book about some leaders, the Maccabees, who form a revolt against those Greek leaders who are trying to suppress the Jewish faith in Palestine. And there's a couple of books written about their exploits. And one of those mentions the library, the book about the kings and the prophets and the writing of David, the letters of the king about votive offerings. So they knew about collections of books. Then in the New Testament, you have numerous references to the scriptures. Remember, that's the ordinary word for writing. We simply Christianized it in the New Testament, and so we fall back on the Latin word and capitalize it in most cases, because clearly they were referencing some kind of corpus, collection of material that was important. And you get it referred to as the book of the law, the book of Moses, as it is written oftentimes. Sometimes a particular person, writer, prophet is mentioned. But you get interesting implications that there is a cohesive set of material going on here. For instance, in John 10:14, Jesus in a controversy says, "Has it not been written in your law, I said, you are gods?" And what's fascinating, you see, is that the reference Jesus is referring to is in Psalm 82. He didn't call it the Psalm. He didn't reference David. He referenced the law, like he does when he quotes Moses, Genesis or Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or Deuteronomy. He puts it in the same category. Paul does the same thing. One of the passages, they quote the prophet Isaiah, but the quote doesn't come from the book of Isaiah. It comes from one of the other prophets. But Isaiah was the first prophet in the collection of the latter prophets. So it looks like they're referencing the collection, not a particular book. And then at the end of Luke, you have this reference by Jesus, by Luke. These things are written about me in the law of the prophets, Luke 24:27, the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Now, is he referring only to these 5 collections of Psalms? Or is he referring to this whole collection of other writings that include Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and other things? And then you have that interesting passage in 2 Timothy. The writings inspired by God are useful. And then in 2 Timothy, you have the reference to the books. And then there's the passage in Peter where there's the reference to the writings, which include Paul. So Peter seems to throw Paul in with some of those other writings that may refer to this collection they have in the Old Testament.
Brother Daer, Brother Platt?
Pardon?
Hi, just a quick question. So
Sure.
in asking those questions, like when he talks about the prophets, which books are included and stuff, and maybe I'm jumping the gun and you will get to this later in your lecture or later in the class, but then how did they get the canon then? Or how did they come to decide what the canon was?
That's what we're looking at. What's
Right.
in this collection? There clearly was, as we're seeing here, some kind of collection of books, of documents. And they could refer to it as a collection. That the passage where Jesus says the law, but he quotes from Psalms. So apparently it was possible to talk about the law and know that you're talking about more than the Torah, just those first 5 books of the Old Testament that the Jews ultimately call the Torah. There seemed that reference seems to include, in this case, the book of Psalms. What else it included, we don't know. At least there's nothing here. The first clear indication we have of something is in a man who lived in the days of Jesus. He's a Jew who becomes a commander of the guerrillas who rise against the Romans in Galilee. His army is defeated, he's captured, and so he goes over to the other side. And he becomes an agent for the Romans. So he survives. He survives very well. Josephus, in the process, begins to write a defense of his people and a history of his people to educate the Romans about the Jews And so there are several books that he writes, most of which are preserved to this day, and you can go read them if you want to. In one of those books, against Apion, who was a critic of his, he points out, we do not have 10,000 books disagreeing with and contradicting one another, but 22 books, which contain the records of all time and are just believed to be divine. 5 are Moses, 13 of the prophets from Moses' time to Artaxerxes, emperor of Persia, 4 of hymns, so now you can start to count up. Now it's possible you see that the book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd, Kings, 1st and 2nd, Chronicles, 1st and 2nd, would only count of 1 each. If you counted the 12 prophets as 1, not 12, if you counted Ezra and Nehemiah as 1, not 2, then you can pretty closely get our 39 books of the Old Testament down to 22. And he's writing in the 1st century.
This is Josephus.
This is Josephus. In one of the other books written in this time, it's called 4th Esdras. We have the high priest made public 24 books. He mentions another 70 that were preserved, kept semi-secret, but 24. And of course, again, take our 39 books, shuffle the combinations a little bit, and you could come up with 24. In 90, somewhere around there, some of the Jewish leaders in Palestine, now Jerusalem has been destroyed for 70 years. So the Jewish leadership that used to reside in Jerusalem has now shifted to the coast to this place called Jamnia or Yavna, depending on which language you're dealing with. And in one of their meetings, there were some discussions about the material that made the hands unclean. That's their terminology. They don't specify a list. The record that was kept just mentions some that there were some doubts about. And that included Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Esther, and Ezekiel. And their terminology is interesting. These were apparently considered somewhat sacred, and therefore, if you held them, you would be made unclean, i.e., you had to cleanse yourself. There's some speculation that this is the same thing going on in the Old Testament for a woman's period and for her giving birth to a child. And what you have going on is reverse terminology. They use the word unclean, but what's really involved is that the situation had made something, in the case of the woman, in the case of the books, sacred. And after you had handled them, you had to be unsacralized, unholyized, to go back to your normal affairs. Then in the time of Jesus, you remember frequently with his discussions of the Pharisees, you get the terminology, the tradition of the fathers have said. The Jews of Jesus' day and sometime during the end of the Old Testament time, in that first 2 or 3 centuries before Jesus, there arises in Judaism the attempt to apply Old Testament rules and regulations to totally new social situations that arose. And you get this class of scholars, Bible students, who try to make those accommodations. And in the process, they end up separating themselves into 2 kind of wings. And the one wing has traditionally been classified as the conservative. They were more concerned about preserving the literal text of the Old Testament and not going beyond it. The others were trying to find ways to deal with old things that didn't really fit the new situations. Much of the tithing procedure, for instance, you see in the Old Testament is based on farming or herding. Well, what if you're a merchant? How do you calculate? And a lot of other things, it's the same way. And so there had arisen this idea of the oral law, that on Mount Sinai, Moses wrote down the written law. He was given the oral law, and that was transmitted orally through the centuries. And that's the tradition of the fathers. And so there was this commitment to the orality of these things. And so there was objection to writing down stuff. But by the 300s, Judaism recognized, their leaders recognized, we need to get this stuff down, so we're talking about the same thing. So they began to write down these traditions, and this eventually develops into a book called the Mishnah, and then there's a commentary through the centuries on the Mishnah that is now called the Talmud. And in some of this material, you get a couple of references, like the one in Baba Batra. Our rabbis taught it's possible to fasten the Torah, the prophets, and the Hagiographa, the writings, together. Others think they're really different enough, you really shouldn't put them together. And then in one place, they talk about the rabbis taught the order of the prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, and the 12. The order of the writings: Ruth, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Lamentation, Daniel, Esther, Ezra, and Chronicles. And that's virtually our Old Testament. And then a second tractate, all scriptures render the hands unclean, same terminology. Song of Solomon's and Ecclesiastes do that, they belong. Rabbi Judah says Song of Songs does, but Ecclesiastes, there's some dissension. Then among the Christians, by the end of the 2nd century, 170, you have the Bishop of Sardis, who's mentioning 5 books of Moses, 4 of the kingdoms. That would be Samuel, Kings, 2 of the Chronicles, David's Psalms, Solomon's Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Job, the prophet Isaiah, Jeremiah, 12, Daniel, Ezekiel, and Ezra. Origen, another Christian scholar, in 184 to 254, has 22 books in both the Hebrew and the Greek names, and he lists them out. Then he mentions the Maccabees, which we quoted from. Jerome in 385 is asked to revise the plethora of Latin translations that have been made of the Bible since the Western Christianity, which includes North Africa. And after working on it for a while, Jerome gives up. He goes back to Palestine so he can learn Hebrew, so he can go to the Hebrew text and translate the Bible afresh. And in the process, he decides that he's going to use the collection that the Hebrews use, which, depending on how you combine them and so forth, is 22, 24 books. The Latin Bibles by then frequently had some other books that we're going to talk about in a minute. And so there was considerable pressure for him to include those, which he eventually does, and we get the traditional Latin Bible. Now, while this awareness of a collection is going on, we're getting a whole plethora of other materials being written. I mentioned this letter of Aristeas that tells us about the emergence of the Greek translation. Well, there were a whole bunch of books. And so if you'll go to the second document, the outside the canon, there were a whole scatter books. And they've ended up in two basic collections for us. One collection of books gets included, various ones of them, in lists of these accepted documents for the Old Testament. They get included in copies, especially as books come into existence and you have an actual bound book. Then some of these books that are written between the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, Malachi, and the time of Jesus and the apostles show up in this Bible, along with most of the books of the New Testament that we know and most of the books of the Old Testament that we know. Now, there aren't very many of these that are very old. Literally, there's like 3 in the 4th and the 5th century. And then you got a few that creep up before, you get into the early Middle Ages, before you begin to have very many of these copies. And in those early days, they don't all have the same different books. Jerome and in these list makers in these first 4 centuries come up with different terminology for these variety of books, and they break them down into various groups. Look on page 2 of Outside the Canon. The terminology that ultimately gets applied to this group of books that get included in copies is the Apocrypha. And the word Apocrypha is a Greek word. It's the opposite of the word apocalypse. The apocalypse is the Greek word we translate revelation, to reveal, to show. The Apocrypha is the opposite word, the antonym, to hide. There are all kinds of explanations for why it gets used. It gets used in different ways, gets used by different people. Jerome is probably the one who settled on using that term in his conflict with which books he was going to include in his Latin translation. But on page 2, you'll notice mentions of Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen, discussing books of various values, the 3 Greek Bibles in the 4th and the 5th century, the Bishop of Rome in the mid-4th century, the list of the 60 in the 7th century, in the 9th century, and there were others who break the books up into different groups, and they use different names for these groups.
Yeah, what you said.
But there's this collection of a couple of dozen books that appear in some lists, not in others. They appear in some copies and not others.
Talk to you, say no.
Yes.
Oh, you doing homework.
I did that early on. Looking up these ring cameras and looking at one more camera I'm about to buy. So I can put that ring up that camera.
Oh, okay.
I'm on Amazon.
What the kids is?
The boy doing dishes and
Mr. Platt, I believe you have the ability to mute her from your end.
Yeah. And I couldn't figure out why it didn't mute, why it wasn't muted.
Oh, well, she's muted now, so I think you're fine.
Okay. And we eventually end up with a fairly common group of these in the Latin Bibles and in the Latin Bible that Jerome develops, which becomes the official Bible of the Western Church, and in Bibles used in the Eastern Church, and in Bibles used in the Egyptian, the Coptic Church, and the Ethiopian Church, and then the Syrian Church that uses the Aramaic to the east. They have some of these books in their collection. Sometimes they variously refer to them in ways that are less authoritative, more devotional ways. The Greeks develop a tradition of using their Bibles as broken up to be read series of verses, chapters every day of the year. And so often the Greek Bible gets chopped up, and it's not book by book, it's section by section for the day, for the week. And so it's not, and so in some of those, for instance, since these are the books that get read, quote, in church, some of these books that are included in other copies of the Greek Bible don't get included because they apparently didn't read these in church. It was all right to read them at home, it was all right to have in your Bible, but for some reason, they weren't read publicly in church. They're called the Apocrypha. We now know, we've known for a long time by name, and gradually we have found fragments and sometimes whole documents of a whole nother selection, probably 30, 40, 50 maybe now, of other writings that were also done and referenced in various ways. And because some of the earliest ones we knew about were attributed to great Old Testament worthies like Moses or Abraham, or one that becomes very dominant is the man Enoch in the Old Testament, who's very clearly a prominent character, very, very early, like in the 5th chapter. But there's not but about 3 verses about him. There's a whole variety of characteristics of this work, but because they were attributed to these old folk that we know Enoch couldn't have written because it was written in Greek, for instance, they were called pseudepigrapha, pseudo false writings. And as scholars began to collect these all together in various materials, that name kind of stuck. And so you have these 2 lists. The Apocrypha that appear to varying degrees in various collections of Bibles. When the Protestant movement broke out in Western Christianity, for a variety of reasons, they fell back on the Hebrew collection that had emerged from the time of Jesus. That's the 39 books we have. Now, they arranged those books differently, the Jews do, but it's identically the same material. And so the Protestants fell back on that, partly because a couple of these books have mentions of a teaching, a practice that the Protestants rejected, and they didn't want that document around, although several of them, including when the English finally got around to printing the King James translation in 1611 and following, they translated all those books and actually printed them in some of their Bibles. Now, the material that's included in those 12 books, you have, of those books that get included into Bibles, you have in 2 charts that I gave you. One shows the whole Bible of the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Latin, and then the King James. And so you see the collection of the way the Hebrew Bible is done. And I mentioned on the first collection I gave you, the Hebrews, the Jews call the first collection Torah. They call the second section, the prophets, by the Hebrew word Nevi'im. And then they call the third collection by the Hebrew word for writings, Ketuvim. And so you have T, N, K. They put 2 A's in there, and so they now have the Tanakh is their acronym for their Bible. The Greek Septuagint is a artificial term. And that's why you have a couple of these things in brackets, because there is no Septuagint Bible. We have some Greek Bibles. They aren't the same. They don't even have the same books in them. it becomes kind of traditionally the Bible of the Greek Orthodox Church, and hence the Russian Church and the Slavic Church and some others that spin off of the Eastern Church. But they don't have all of these necessarily. And what's included here is not in some of those older copies of the Greek Bible that we have, even though they included it in theirs. Then you have the Latin Vulgate. And the Vulgate is our word for common. That's Latin. And that's how we get our word vulgar. The upper echelon of English society after the French, William and Mary, took over England and imported a whole lot of French words. Then the Anglo-Saxon words became the common words, the vulgar words. Wasn't anything wrong with them, they're just the Anglo-Saxon word. And then you have the King James, as it was ultimately printed in many printings. You have a very intriguing, and I mentioned it on this outside the canon, issue with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esdras. Esdras, of course, is simply the Greek form, the Greek name, Ezra in Greek. And what we ended up with in our material that survives is a translation of the book of Ezra into Greek. And a different book, different translation style. Most all the book of Ezra is in there, but it has some other stuff, earlier stuff, like in Chronicles and Kings earlier than Ezra. And so if a Bible had both versions, one would be called First Esdras and the second would be called Second Esdras. There were a couple of other totally different books that got attributed to Ezra, second and third and fourth Esdras. But depending on which books, which copy of the Bible had, as to which one was 1, 2, and 3. And so there's total confusion when somebody talks about First Esdras, Second Esdras, Third Esdras, Fourth Esdras. Well, which one are you talking about? Now, all of this stuff is easily available for you to read. You can pick up a Bible with the Apocrypha in it without any trouble, cheap paperback version. Most of the online Bible programs have, quote, the Catholic version. So you can see any of these books, read any of them you want to. They're the full variety. They're little books like Ruth. There are little books like Proverbs. There are prophets like Daniel and Ezekiel. The book of Ben Sarak is probably the most important one in terms of reading because it appears to be a fully legitimate book written by a Jew, translated by his grandson into Greek, about life in that very early 3rd century. And so it gives you an intriguing insight into Judaism between Ezra and Jesus, for instance. And so some of this material is perfectly worth reading. The first 2 books of Maccabees, which are basically semi-historical, are perfectly worthwhile reading for that time and that 150 years before Jesus, when there is a fight for their faith. And it's good background history for the time of Jesus. The other books,
Mr. Platt?
yes,
So in the canon list that we're following what you're saying, the list for the Latin is technically the Catholic Bible?
yes, that's virtually the Catholic Bible.
And the Greek one, is that
Virtually the Eastern Orthodox.
and that's another
Yeah.
Catholic church, correct?
No, the Eastern Orthodox is a totally separate historical group of churches.
Oh, gotcha.
They have a vast number of traditions different in a whole lot of ways. And they have as legitimate historical claim of continuity as the Catholic Church. In fact, more so because they still speak Greek. So they didn't even have to translate the Bible. They can say, and so when you read some of their scholars in this controversy of the canon, they don't make any apologies that their canon is the right canon because they're a straight line from Paul, and they don't have to fudge on. I use the Bible the way Paul wrote it.
I think it's interesting because when you go to the church, they sing.
Yeah. There are a whole lot of things but it's a significantly independent tradition. They were the early Catholic Church, 500 to 1100, claimed a universal authority over all the church, East and West. But of course, the Coptic Christians didn't buy that. The Ethiopian Christians didn't buy that. The Syrian Christians didn't buy that. The Jacobite Christians that had been thrown out in the 4th century didn't buy it at all. But the Greek church was always its own entity and own traditions and practices. And they only considered the Bishop of Rome as one of the bishops, or archbishops, as they call their 5 guys. They never had one, and he was just one of them. And they never gave him, recognized the Bishop of Rome with any greater authority than any of these others had. 5 of their own, and he was only one, so he was outvoted so far as they were concerned. So as the Catholic Church solidifies in the 500s to 1500s, the Greek Orthodox Church is off doing its own thing. They have a big spat in the 1100s where they say, well, hey, let's go our separate ways. But they were never together. And the reality, of course, is the Western Church in and of itself was not solidified. There was vast variety. And that's why the efforts, when the Reformation begins to gain steam, there are serious efforts in the Catholic Church, as they have come to call themselves, to establish uniformity because it wasn't there. I don't think any of you have been in my class before. I have a classic story. Back in the 60s when I was here, I got to go to a day conference sponsored by the Jewish synagogue, and they brought in a Catholic priest who had his PhD in Martin Luther to talk about the Reformation. And this Catholic scholar insisted that there were any number of official Roman Catholic courts that Martin Luther could have been tried in, and he would have been found not guilty. He would not have been declared a heretic, because the scholars in that area were more in agreement with him than they were with those authorities who declared him heretic. Now, I don't have any ground to say that's not true, but I had a church history professor who just absolutely insisted that he himself had seen the historical material of medieval churches that demonstrated that they were far more primitive New Testament Christians in their practice than the Roman Catholic Church was. That they still had shared communion, that is, the priest and the people got to take of the bread and the cup. They still baptized by immersion. They read scripture regularly. Their priests were literate. And so the idea that there was one single solidified just didn't settle. This other collection of material is a vast collection, and I give you in this outside the canon a list beginning on verse 4 of this pseudepigrapha. I give you a sample of some of them. And there again, there is a website, Sacred Texts, that you can go to online, and you can read all 93 or whatever they found of these books, these writings. This number has increased considerably with the Qumran discoveries, because there were fragments of stuff we found there and whole books of stuff we found there that we didn't know about until then. And most of the collections of these writings, academic or scholarly ones, have all this stuff together now. Some of the older ones collect this older collection of pseudepigrapha together, and then there'll be another collection of the Judean documents or the Qumran documents or some terminology like that. There was just a plethora of this material. What's intriguing and important, of course, is that it was there, it was known, but it just doesn't seem to be used. And just like the conference that we quoted a while earlier about Jamnia or Yavna, that wasn't an official meeting of the leaders of Judaism to decide on their canon. They're there for other reasons. They're not even talking about a canon. They're just discussing those documents that there's some question about. Do they make the hands unclean? And it wouldn't make any difference, because in Jesus' day, in Yavna's day, those Jewish officials in Palestine are not the officials of Judaism. There are way more Jews back in Babylon, back in Mesopotamia, and all the great leaders of Jesus' day that you hear bandied about, the Hillels and the Shammais, they all came from Babylon. They weren't Palestinians. So even if these guys had called a formal conference and had made a formal declaration that these are the sacred books of Judaism, the ones that make your hands unclean, and there are no others, even if they had done that, it would hardly mean anything. Because their Mishnah and their Talmud disappeared. And Orthodox Judaism, as we know it today, is the product of the Mesopotamian Judaism. Now we've rediscovered the Talmud of the Palestinians, but they weren't the authority, ultimately. And among the Christians, there was never a meeting over trying to decide who this was. They talked about what was, what wasn't. There was this list by this guy, that list. In the 4th century, they finally meet and say, well, yeah, this. It gets even more intriguing because even though the Latin Bibles had some of these other books in them, when the Protestants started rejecting them, there's not an official declaration of those books until the Council of Trent says, oh, it's wrong to suppress these books, to reject these books. And in the official record of doing it, they forget to name 3 of them in the list. The canon is exactly like the writing of the Old Testament in terms of we don't know how many. It just happened. How this material, and my suspicion is that the major impetus behind the Old Testament canon is that Greek translation, such that there aren't but 5 books, I think, of the Old Testament that aren't quoted in the New Testament, and only a couple of possible allusions to any of these outside books. Now, there are some documents around, there are some studies around that inflate that list to several, but they're talking clearly about allusions, about phraseology, where the closest that comes to it is the book of Jude, where there is the controversy over the burial over Moses' body. And there's a similar statement like that in the book of Enoch. But whether Jude is relying on that source or whether this is a common tradition, remember, there are a couple of times in the New Testament where reference is made, like in the book of Hebrews, where because of the phenomena at Mount Sinai, the writer of Hebrews says, even Moses said, I trembled, I was afraid. Well, there's nothing in the Torah that has Moses saying that. So where did the writer of Hebrews get that? Well, maybe he'd read it somewhere. We still haven't found the place where he read it. Maybe this was one of those oral traditions. Yeah, and maybe he just imagined it, you know? And of course, how you're willing to rule on this is greatly dependent upon how you consider this material. What your understanding of its, quote, inspiration is. As to whether you're willing to accept the fact that the writer could have invented it. And of course, you see, if you believe in solid inspiration, well then, hey, the Holy Spirit told him and he wrote it. So the fact that it's not in the Old Testament doesn't bother you a bit. And so you can say that, quote, he invented it. Well, of course, it wasn't him, it was the Holy Spirit. And you know, how you describe where this writer got this is greatly dependent upon how you understand this inspiration process. So we end up with this collection of material. Now, if you go read these books of the quote Apocrypha, you will see that by and large, they have some resemblance to the material in the Old Testament, but they aren't particularly identical to it. And the reality is, if you included them, you're not going to get a majorly different idea about what God is or what he's like or what he does. You're going to get a reference to praying for the dead in one case. Well, is that any more weird and unexplainable than Paul's reference to baptism for the dead in 1 Corinthians? Which Christendom has never been able to really wrestle with easily, comfortably. They didn't adopt that as a practice. So we not know exactly what was going on, but so these people were praying for the deceased. Is that significantly different than what Paul mentions? And therefore so wrong that the book shouldn't be read? But the fact that it was done by them doesn't mean we have to make it a practice. Doesn't mean we would expect to do it too. And you'll notice in the list of the Apocrypha, several of these things are not books at all. They're just an additional chapter. The Prayer of Manasseh, for instance, is nothing more than the prayer that the Kings and Chronicle recorders simply say, he prayed and the Lord heard his prayer. Well, here's the prayer. Well, maybe it's as authentic as the record that he did it. And of course, one scholarly could argue that based on, well, does it appear to be amenable to being Greek translated in Hebrew translated into Greek? Or does not really work well, and so it really had to be written in Greek? Well, if it was written in Greek, then of course he couldn't have prayed it, because this was long before he would have had any interest or ability in learning Greek. And so it's, quote, false attributed, it's pseudepigrapha, and therefore really shouldn't be considered scripture. And the stories in Daniel are the same kind of thing. But remember, as we're going to see, we have the story in the New Testament of a woman taken in adultery and brought to Jesus. And as we shall see, there are real significant manuscript issues with that story. So there are any number of scholars who are willing to say it probably is an authentic story of Jesus, but John didn't write it in his record. John didn't include it in his guide. It got put in later, but he didn't do it. But that doesn't mean the story isn't true. Well, there again, you see, then you start working with, well, how do you understand this inspiration process, and which direction or extreme are you trying to push it? Given the Hebrew, the Jewish tradition, given the inconsistency with which these books of the Apocrypha appear in the various lists and the various early documents of the Old Testament, there's no problem with leaving them out of your Bible. You'd be on pretty solid ground. And certainly in terms of authority. But remember, see, you're dealing with the Old Testament. And its authority in detail, in specifics, has been significantly modified by its displacement by the New Covenant, by the New Testament. And so there is much in the Old Testament, even if you consider it Word of God, you don't consider it, quote, authoritative for your Christian life. Which means you're weighing the canon differently, which you have to, because the New Testament canon does that. It clearly does refer to Old Testament in very authoritative ways, many times to reduce its authority. The classic example, of course, is being the place that circumcision plays in the Old Testament. And it's utterly displaced in the New Testament, in the Christian faith. Totally. And the New Testament writers, even Jesus himself, quote the Old Testament to validate the decision not to make circumcision an issue anymore. To make the status of the non-circumcised no longer dependent upon their circumcision, but only on their faith. And so the canonical status of the Old Testament is significantly modified. So one could argue, why are we arguing about what's in the canon of the Old Testament? You see, it doesn't make any difference if you put in all the pseudepigrapha. Certainly the Apocrypha is not going to change that much. Now that it becomes an issue for some Christians, of course, because they don't make that difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. They don't see that radical change that occurs in the New Testament when the previous covenant is clearly displaced by a new covenant that operates on a radically different but identical basis. Faith is still the primary basis in both covenants. But the righteousness by which God judges us is changed from being ours to being Jesus's. Have I thoroughly confused you?
I kind of
Uh,
had a comment or question about, well, at some point it might be, good to read some of these books and see what it reads. And in the book that you assigned us, the How We Got the Bible, in chapter 15, it talks about, it gives the several reasons why these have been rejected. And I was a
Yeah.
little interested about the one where it says that Judith, the book of Judith in the Apocrypha, that she apparently uses flattery and lies, even praying that God might use deceit upon her lips. And she's the heroine of the story, but I guess she's enforcing the principle of doing evil, that good may come of it. So, is it, if we're thinking that this book in particular could be a part of the Bible, even if there's a Christian thinking, okay, that was the Old Testament and here's the New Testament. I mean, don't we all kind of try to apply the Bible in general sometimes to our lives? And
yes, and that's one of the tricky things in dealing with it. But see, even that reference, you see, that you quoted, which would be troublesome to us, that would be in the Bible. But there again, is that statement any worse than what occurs in the Psalms 2 or 3 times, where my enemy is cursed and may his children be orphans and his wife a widow, and there again, you see, it's easy to say when you isolate this book and say, well, that shouldn't be in there because of that. But when you stop and think about it, you realize, well, there's some material that's just as bad that did make it in. And quite apart from this Old Testament, New Testament thing, there is a major problem that Christianity solved, and Judaism did too, for that matter, by significantly blunting biblical authority by church leadership and its tradition. And so we can, by creating the idea that the living church, its leaders, possess significant authority almost equal to that of the apostles and the Bible writers. And of course, in the Roman church, they took that thoroughly. So in the Roman church, you don't have to have biblical authority for anything. The church has the authority to decide anything on any basis at any time for any reason, because they believe the church has that authority. In fact, you will find apologists among them who will argue that the Bible only has authority because we, the church, said these are the books. And we, the church, can say how they're to be understood. They take Peter's passage. It's not for private interpretation to mean it's not for private interpretation. You have to follow the church's interpretation. The church gave us the word, the written word. It was the churchmen of the first century who gave us the written word, and the Lord left with his church the responsibility of properly, under the guidance of the Spirit, of interpreting that word and interpreting how it should be applied in every changing social situation. And therefore, if the situation has changed, we can almost say, well, this doesn't work at all. We'll have to ignore it. Most of Christendom, when push comes to shove, operates with dual authority: Scripture and the tradition of the church.
That tradition of the church has been changed.
And it changes, and they make no bones about it.
And then they can change that.
And that's what makes possible what looks like radical changes in church decisions today. They can say, well, we obviously misunderstood this. Well, clearly the situation has changed. This doesn't fit this situation. And therefore, we have to come up with a new thing. The Jews did the same thing. They have a whole tradition of what they call responses, just a fancy word for responses. When an issue in a person's life they felt was important enough to be faithful to their Judaism, but they couldn't find the rule to fully apply to it, or they had two rules that bumped into each other on it. Well, what am I going to do here? They would go to the rabbi. Well, if the rabbi didn't have a strong tradition of one way or the other, then they could get a collection of rabbis together and they'd make a ruling that when these two rules bash against the other, then this is the principle you use to decide which one trumps, and that kind of thing. They have volume after volume after volume of this stuff. Through, because of 2,000 years of this, you see, they've been doing this. Yeah. But even within each one of those frames, there are these responses. And of course, as they began to diverge from each other, then there are real differences in the responses. But even among the Orthodox, you can find the responsa from the Jews, from this Jewish council here and this Jewish council over there, and they didn't come to the same conclusion. Over the same issue, over the same argument. And they're really supposed to try to honor each other. And part of the struggle is, well, how do we keep this as cohesive as we can and recognize the reality of diversity of human beings? But
churches do that too, but a Christian, it's just,
yeah,
they sort of go with the flow of whatever society. That's what.
well, but even the tradition that they have is often the result of what was understood in the context of its day. And that's what keeps us divided. It's because we have no common authority. The Roman Church doesn't share the same authority as the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so, there's no way you're going to have an easy ecumenical experience there without kind of ignoring a whole lot of these differences. But you can't completely ignore them because both groups have made these important, critical, unalterable. And therefore, we can't begin to get together. And so it's given this flux, these radical changes and new developments in Christendom, East and West, and a lot of this you see is taking place in this first 3 centuries. You've already got a Latin church, a Coptic church, an Ethiopian church, a Syrian church, an Armenian church. How does this corpus of material emerge out of this much difference? How did we end up with so little disagreement over what our biblical authority should be? Now, we found ways of getting around to develop all these kinds of traditions in each of our ways, but we didn't feel necessary to put in a bunch of new books. We didn't feel necessary to take out a book. And think for just a moment, with the emphasis Martin Luther and the other early reformers made over salvation by faith, why didn't they leave James out of their New Testaments? But they didn't do that. This body of material comes together. Nobody knows really how. Nobody ever really makes a formal declaration until after the fact. And then it's just a consensus, well, yeah, this is what we got. We're not sure about these. We're pretty sure about these. And these, well, we're still kind of, well, some of us do, some of us don't. But in the end, it's these that we collect, we save, and see, go back further when you get to the New Testament, and it's true in the Old Testament. Why did these books emerge in the first place? Out of all those books that we read the names of in the Old Testament, we know those documents were around, but they all disappeared. These didn't. And these people, northern Israel was carried captive in the 8th century. Southern Israel was carried captive in the 6th century. A small group of them come back in the 70 years later and develop a somewhat different center of faith. How is it that just these materials seem to always be there, a few of them kind of on the edge, along with a few others that were on the edge, but when the dust finally settles, this is what we have. And I would suggest that maybe that's providence.
It's the Spirit of God.
Maybe this isn't just coincidence. Maybe this is providence. And therefore, we should pay a far greater attention to them than we do. We shouldn't be near as quick to feel like what we think is as important as what he had written here. Okay, I've kept you way over time, or you've kept me over time. I was ready to leave, but you can ask another question if you want. Next week, we'll talk about the writing of the New Testament and what we know about it, and then we'll talk about its canon.
Thank you, Mr. Platt.
You're welcome.
Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.
Clint's birthday.
Thank
Thank
you.
He'll be 83.
Good night.
Wow. Praise God, he's still got his mind.
Now, what happened to Angie? Now, who else was on here? 1, 2, 3, 4 were on there, and 2 here.
Very sharp, isn't it? Yeah. Forgot more than I'll ever know. Some of those deals. Sorry, Splinter. All right. She didn't leave work till 6:30. She decided since she come in class, she just worked like.
Okay,
But then today, she decided she'd stop all the way home. And I don't really like to do that. Because, I hate for you to be out. I'm sorry, but I know, but I live pretty close, and so. The only thing that, I guess this is about, I got a chase down here sometimes, on Spencer. And,
Don't go at night.
also during the daytime, I have seen, this black lady that was there as an officer, so, and I felt so good about that. But then it was the only time, and then I've been there before during the day, but they don't care, they'll kill you during the day.
That's right, it doesn't matter.
And so they shoot you guns, little girls and stuff, and so,